Most people think that when you seal a room shut and walk away, everything inside it dies. That's what makes sense. No light, no air circulation, no one to tend it. Whatever's in there should rot, collapse, and turn to dust. But there is one kingdom of life that doesn't need light, doesn't need tending, doesn't need anyone to believe in it. It just needs darkness, moisture, and time. Fungi. And in 1931, in a hollow so deep in Harlan County, Kentucky, that the sun only hit the creek bed for 4 hours a day, a 16-year-old girl named Della Spurlock was about to open a door that had been sealed for 20 years and find out exactly what fungi can do when you leave them alone long enough. The root cellar had been her mother's. Everyone in Cane Creek Hollow knew that much. Clara Spurlock had dug it into the north face of the hill behind the homestead in 1909, the year before Della was born, and she had spent 2 years building it by hand. Cut the oak beams herself, laid the creek stone walls herself, hung the door on iron hinges she traded a quilt for at the hardware store in Harlan. Then, in the spring of 1911, Clara sealed it shut, mortared the door frame, piled stone against it. Let the honeysuckle and blackberry grow over it until you couldn't even see where the entrance had been. Nobody knew why. Clara never explained. When people asked, she just said, "It's not ready yet." When they pressed, she stopped answering. Clara died of typhoid in 1913, when Della was 3 years old. She never told anyone what was in the cellar or why she sealed it. She left no journal, no letter, no instructions. Just the cellar, buried under 20 years of wild growth on a hillside that now belonged to Clara's brother-in-law, Vernon. Now you need to understand what Harlan County looked like in 1931. The coal mines that had kept the county alive were shutting down. The operators had cut wages to nothing, and the miners who tried to organize were being shot at by company gun thugs. Families that had been getting by on mine scrip suddenly had nothing, and the families who farmed, who had always been poor but at least had food, were watching their gardens fail because 3 dry summers in a row had cracked the soil to dust. People were hungry. Not the kind of hungry where you skip a meal. The kind of hungry where children stop growing and old people stop getting out of bed. Della was 16 and alone. Vernon had taken the homestead after Clara died and let Della stay on as unpaid labor, cooking, cleaning, hauling water, feeding what was left of the livestock. She slept in the loft of the collapsing barn. She ate whatever Vernon's wife Irene left on the porch after dinner, which wasn't much and was getting less. She had known about the root cellar her whole life. She'd seen the stone wall on the hillside covered in vines, and she'd been told by Vernon that there was nothing behind it but an empty hole her crazy mother had dug for no reason. "Your mama wasn't right in the head," Vernon told her once when she was 12. Digging holes and talking to herself. Whatever she put in there is gone to rot 20 years ago. Della believed him. She had no reason not to. She had no memory of her mother. No photographs, no letters. Just a name and the word crazy attached to it. Then old Bessie Caudle came to see her. Bessie was 81 years old. She lived alone 2 hollows south in a cabin that should have fallen down a decade ago. She had been Clara Spurlock's closest friend, and she had kept Clara's secret for 20 years because Clara had asked her to. "Your mama made me promise," Bessie said. She was sitting on a stump behind the barn, so thin and bent she looked like a bundle of sticks wrapped in a cardigan. She said, "Don't tell her until she's old enough and hungry enough to need it. I think that time has come." "Need what?" Della said. "What's in the cellar?" "Vernon says it's empty." Bessie made a sound that was half laugh and half cough. "Vernon doesn't know anything about what your mama could do. He thought she was crazy because he couldn't understand what she understood. Your mama knew things about what grows in the dark that nobody in this county has ever known. She learned it from a book she found in the Harlan Library, written by a man in Japan about growing mushrooms on wood. And she figured the rest out herself. Bessie told her what Clara had done. How she had spent 2 years preparing the cellar. How she had inoculated oak logs with shiitake spawn she ordered through the mail from a university in Pennsylvania. How she had set up oyster mushroom cultures on beds of damp straw. How she had lined the shelves with jars of grain and rye that she deliberately cracked to allow certain spores to colonize. And how she had sealed the whole thing shut because the cultures needed years, not weeks, not months, but years, of undisturbed darkness and steady moisture to fully establish. She said 20 years, Bessie told Della. She said by then the whole cellar would be alive. She sealed it for you, child. She knew she might not live to open it herself. Della didn't believe it. She told Bessie it was a nice story, but mushrooms don't grow for 20 years in a sealed room with no one tending them. Things die when you abandon them. That's how the world works. Bessie just looked at her with that one good eye and said, "The dark is where all seeds begin." That night, Della couldn't sleep. She lay in the barn loft, listening to rats in the walls, and thinking about her mother sealing a door shut in 1911 and telling an old woman not to say anything for 20 years. Either Clara Spurlock was crazy, or she understood something nobody else did. If you want to find out what Della found when she broke through that wall, and why it made grown men who hadn't cried in 30 years stand in that cellar with tears running down their faces, subscribe to The Hidden Harvest and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what was growing in that cellar wasn't just food. It was 20 years of a dead woman's love, still alive in the dark. Della went to the cellar at dawn. She brought the rusted trowel she used for the garden and a kerosene lantern she stole from Vernon's tool shed. The hillside was a wall of blackberry and honeysuckle so thick she had to hack through it with a corn knife for an hour before she found the stone. The mortar Clara had used was old but solid. Della worked the trowel into the joints and pried stones loose one at a time. Her hands bled. Her shoulders burned. She didn't stop. It took her most of the morning to clear enough stone to reach the oak door behind it. The door was swollen with moisture and black with age, but the iron hinges still held. She pulled. It didn't move. She braced her boots against the stone frame and pulled with everything she had. The door opened with a sound like a coffin lid. The air that came out was cool and thick and smelled of earth and something else. Something alive. Rich, loamy, almost sweet. Like the floor of a forest after rain, but concentrated. Della held the lantern up and stepped inside, and she dropped to her knees. The cellar was alive. Every surface, the shelves, the walls, the oak beams, the floor, was covered in mushrooms, not the thin, pale toadstools that grow on dead wood in the forest. These were full, fat, healthy, fruiting bodies, growing in dense clusters. Oyster mushrooms cascaded from the shelves in pale gray and cream-colored shelves that looked like flowing water frozen in place. Shiitake caps the size of her palm covered the oak logs her mother had stacked along the back wall. Their surfaces cracked in the pattern that Japanese growers call donko, the highest quality, the kind that only develop in slow, cold growth over many years. And on the back wall, where the groundwater seeped through the stone, something she had never seen before. A thick mat of reddish-brown fungus growing in overlapping shelves like the pages of a book. She didn't know what it was, but it was beautiful, and it was enormous, and it was very clearly alive. 20 years. Her mother had sealed this room 20 years ago, and the fungi had done exactly what Clara knew they would do. They had colonized every available surface, from the seep, the perfect darkness. From the seep, the perfect darkness. Clara had created an ecosystem, a living machine that fed itself and grew itself and needed nothing from the outside world. Della sat on the clay floor surrounded by 20 years of her mother's work, and she wept. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming understanding that her mother, the woman Vernon called crazy, had built this for her, had sealed it shut knowing she might never see it opened, had trusted the darkness and the time and the biology to do what she could not do herself. She wept because her mother had loved her enough to build something that would wait. When she stopped crying, she started thinking. The mushrooms were food, real food, protein, nutrients, substance. The Shiitake alone could feed a family. The oysters were prolific. They'd regrow from the same substrate multiple times, and there were jars on the shelves that hadn't cracked. Sealed tight, still holding grain that might still be viable after 20 years in cool, dry conditions. But she couldn't eat them all herself, and she couldn't let Vernon find out. Vernon would take everything. He'd already taken the house, the land, her labor. If he knew about the cellar, he'd claim it and sell every mushroom at market, while Della went back to sleeping in the barn. So she did what her mother would have done. She worked in secret. She went to the cellar before dawn and after dark. She harvested small amounts, never enough to reduce the visible growth. She dried shiitake caps on a flat rock behind the barn where Vernon never looked. She learned, through trial and painful error, which mushrooms to eat and which to leave for propagation. She read the one book Bessie brought her, a water-damaged copy of the same Japanese mycology text her mother had found, by lantern light in the barn loft. The first time she ate a fresh oyster mushroom sautéed in lard over the barn stove, she sat very still for a long time afterward. It was the first real meal she'd had in months that she hadn't stolen scraps for. It tasted like the forest. It tasted like being alive. Within a month, she was feeding Bessie, too. Within 2 months, she was leaving baskets of dried mushrooms on the porches of the 3 poorest families in the hollow. The Brashears, the Collinses, and the Hensleys, who had 7 children and nothing in the cupboard but cornmeal and lard. She never told them where the food came from. She left it at night. But people in hollows know each other's business the way they know the weather, and it didn't take long for word to spread that someone was leaving food, and it didn't take much longer for people to start watching. Vernon found out in November. He followed Della to the hillside one morning before dawn and watched her disappear into the vines. When she came out carrying a basket of pale mushrooms, he was standing there with a face like a closed fist. "That's my land," he said. "That's my cellar. Everything in it belongs to me." Della looked at him. She was thin and small and 16 years old, and she had her mother's trowel in her rope belt and nothing else. Vernon outweighed her by 100 pounds. "Mama built it," Della said. "Mama sealed it. Mama left it for me." "Your mama left everything to me when she died because you were 3 years old and couldn't hold a deed. I own this land. I own that hole in the ground, and I own whatever's growing in it." He pushed past her and went inside. When Vernon Spurlock stepped into that root cellar, he stopped moving. He held his lantern up and turned in a slow circle, and his mouth fell open, and for the first and only time in Della's memory, Vernon Spurlock had nothing to say. 20 years of growth. Mushrooms covering every surface. The sweet loam smell. The impossible fact that a dead woman had built a living thing that had survived 2 decades without a single human hand touching it. He stood there for a full minute. Then he cleared his throat and said, in a voice that wasn't quite steady, "I'll be taking these to market in Harlan." But he never did, because Bessie Caudle had spent those 2 months doing something besides eating mushrooms. She had walked to the county courthouse in Harlan, 7 miles each way on bad legs, and she had found the deed. Clara Spurlock's deed. Filed in 1909, never transferred, never contested. The land behind the homestead, including the hillside where the root cellar sat, had been deeded separately from the house. Clara had bought that half-acre from the original landowner with her own money, saved from selling quilts and herbs at the Harlan market, and she had left it in a will filed with the county clerk that Vernon had never known about. The will left the half-acre, and everything on it and in it, to her daughter Della. Vernon fought it. Of course he did. He went to the county clerk and argued and threatened and even offered money he didn't have. But the deed was clear and the will was legal, and the clerk, who had known Clara Spurlock and remembered her as the quiet woman who sold the best dried herbs in the county, told Vernon to go home. Della owned the cellar, and by the following spring, what she did with it changed the hollow. She didn't keep it to herself. That's the part that matters. She could have. She had every right to. But she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had built the cellar not for profit, but for preservation. So Della taught. She showed the Brazier family how to inoculate logs with Shiitake spawn from her mother's cultures. She gave the Collins family oyster mushroom substrate and showed them how to keep it producing in their own root cellar. She walked the Hensley children through the process step by step, how to cut, how to dry, how to store. By the end of 1932, 7 families in Cane Creek Hollow were growing mushrooms underground. By 1933, it was 14. They sold dried shiitake at the Harlan market for prices that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier, because good dried mushrooms were one of the few things people would still pay cash money for, even in the Depression. And the red-brown fungus on the back wall? The one Della didn't recognize? Old Bessie knew what it was. She had seen Clara cultivating it and asked about it 20 years ago. It was reishi, Ganoderma lucidum, a medicinal mushroom that had been used in East Asian medicine for centuries. Clara Spurlock, a woman from a Kentucky hollow with a 3rd-grade education, had somehow gotten reishi culture and established it on the wet stone wall of her root cellar. That colony, 20 years old, undisturbed, thriving, was producing fruiting bodies that a professor from the University of Kentucky later said were among the finest specimens he had ever seen in North America. Della didn't sell the reishi. She dried it and made tea, the way Bessie said Clara used to. She gave it to sick people in the hollow. She couldn't prove it healed anything. But the old people who drank it said they felt stronger, and the children who had been listless and pale started getting color back in their faces. And maybe that was the reishi. And maybe it was just having enough to eat for the first time in years. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Clara Spurlock had put it there, 20 years before anyone needed it, because she understood something that Vernon and everyone like Vernon would never understand. You don't build for today. You build for the people who come after you, and sometimes the best thing you can do for them is seal the door and trust the dark. Della Spurlock lived in Cane Creek Hollow until she was 78 years old. She maintained her mother's root cellar her entire life. She expanded it twice, once in 1940 and again in 1955, and by the time she died in 1993, that cellar held over 40 varieties of cultivated mushroom, including 5 medicinal species that university researchers came from 3 states away to study. She never married. She never left the hollow. When people asked her why, she always said the same thing. Everything I need is in the dark. That's the power of building something that can survive without you. Subscribe to The Hidden Harvest for more stories about the forgotten knowledge that kept people alive when nothing else could. And tell me in the comments, if you could leave one thing sealed in a room for your grandchildren to find, what would it be? Clara Spurlock sealed a door in 1911 and trusted the darkness to do the rest. 20 years later, her daughter opened it and fed a county. Some things don't die in the dark. Some things are just waiting for someone brave enough to open the door.